All right, today we are diving into something pretty seismic in Mexico's ongoing cartel wars. We're looking at a recent analysis that says something just happened that, well, almost nobody thought was even possible. And just to give you a sense of the shockwaves this sent out, even experts who have been tracking the cartels for decades were apparently caught completely by surprise. I mean, this quote right here, it really says it all. So, what is all this about? It's this. The head of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, a man known as El Mencho, one of the most powerful and, frankly, heavily protected narco-traffickers on the entire planet, has just been taken off the board. Now, to really grasp why this is such a huge deal, you've got to understand that El Mencho wasn't just seen as some criminal. According to this analysis, he was considered untouchable, supposedly protected by incredibly deep connections inside the Mexican government itself. So that brings up the big question, right? Every single time the U.S. had located El Mencho in the past and tried to work with their Mexican counterparts, poof, he'd vanish. He was getting tipped off. So what on earth changed this time? So how did they pull it off? Well, this wasn't just another mission. This was a completely different playbook, one designed specifically to break that old cycle of leaks and, let's be honest, failures. The strategy, according to the source, was incredibly meticulous. First, U.S. Navy SEALs came in and trained a specially selected Mexican military unit for a mission they knew nothing about. Then, and this is the crucial part, that entire unit was put on lockdown, sequestered. No phones, no internet, no contact with the outside world at all. It created a total information black hole, making it impossible for any leaks to get out before they finally launched the op. And you can just see how different this was. Instead of that broad cooperation that was just riddled with leaks, the new approach was like a scalpel, a small, totally vetted unit, a complete communication blackout, and a laser focus on the main target himself. But this is where the story gets even crazier. The official line is that El Mencho was injured and later died on a helicopter. The analyst behind this report, though, he's pretty skeptical. He suggests that a much more pragmatic, even ruthless decision was probably made right there on the ground. The thinking being, a guy with his connections is just way too dangerous to keep alive in any prison system. So that brings us to the big political why. Why would the Mexican government, after supposedly protecting this guy for so many years, suddenly go all in on taking him out? Well, the answer, according to this analysis, has almost nothing to do with a change of heart. The central argument from this source is that this wasn't a voluntary move by Mexico at all. It was the direct result of a massive, escalating pressure campaign from the United States that basically left them with no other choice. So how did this pressure campaign apparently play out? Well, according to the analysis, it started with the U.S. hitting narco boats, a clear signal of a new approach. Then came the public warnings that the U.S. was ready to act by itself inside Mexico. In response, Mexico started handing over some of El Mencho's rivals, kind of trying to appease the U.S. But the pressure just kept building, until finally, facing a very real threat of U.S. military action on their own soil, Mexico caved and agreed to the operation. And at the end of the day, this analysis concludes that the Mexican president was completely backed into a corner. I mean, can you imagine the political fallout from a unilateral U.S. operation happening inside her country? It was a risk she just couldn't take. So cooperating, even if it meant giving up a protected asset, became the only real option on the table. Okay, so the kingpin is down. But what happens next? Does the whole empire just collapse overnight? Well, history tells us it's a lot more complicated and a lot more violent than that. And this is where we get into a military strategy called the decapitation doctrine. The idea here isn't just to get rid of one leader. The real goal is to set off a very predictable and very chaotic chain of events. According to the source, what happens next is a violent but expected process. First, a massive power vacuum opens up. That leads to a bunch of lieutenants all fighting each other for control. And yes, that means a sharp but short-term spike in violence is probably coming. But the long-term goal? The cartel shatters into smaller, weaker gangs that just don't have the muscle to influence the national government anymore. The source uses a really powerful analogy to explain this. Taking out El Mencho? That's not the end of the war. But it is D-Day. It's that huge, decisive moment that kicks off a new, chaotic, but absolutely necessary phase of the whole conflict. So this all sounds very strategic, but does it actually put Mexico on a path to being safer in the long run? Or are we just creating a power vacuum for a new generation of monsters to fill? Well, according to this analysis, the answer to that question depends almost entirely on what happens next, not in Mexico, but in the United States. The source basically presents two very different paths. The first path says that if future U.S. policy becomes what the author calls soft on things like illegal immigration and asylum claims, you're essentially turning the cartel's economic engines back on. That money refunds and re-empowers them, and Mexico slips right back into its old habit. Now, the second path, according to this analysis, is all about sustained pressure. The argument goes that if the U.S. maintains what the author describes as a tough stance on border security and keeps up the diplomatic pressure, you choke off the cartel's main sources of revenue. This keeps them fragmented and weak, and it forces Mexico to keep cooperating. So really, the huge takeaway from this whole analysis is that the security of Mexico and the power of its cartels is now completely tied to policy decisions being made in Washington, D.C. The entire game has changed, and the next move is absolutely critical. And all of this leaves us with a final and very practical question. As these powerful cartel factions start a brutal war for control, and they start targeting each other's money-making operations, which definitely includes tourist areas, is it actually safe for an outsider to go there right now? That's definitely something to think about.